So let's try to um, curb and maim the ambitions of a pernicious error, which is draping itself over readers of Heidegger quite frequently, I believe. The error itself requires a certain sophistication even to detect the crude outline of the place that it occurs. What I'm referring to is the issue of being not yet being taken up as a question properly by the first Greeks. However much we Heidegger brings us through his enthusiasm to treat them as beings of Dasein or wonder, as stars we see across our horizon. Nonetheless, what he's saying explicitly is that the being of beings was that being was understood as physis by the Greeks, physis rather than the suke or the soul. So I give an example of what this means straightforwardly in Historia or history, or that is as a report of things that happened. There was a battle about 7 years before the death of Socrates called the Battle of the Arginusa, which are some islands where the Athenian dead, were left by, let's say, enlightened generals. Where did this Aufklärung come from? It came from the philosophers who sold the notion to the souls of the generals that their souls and their somas, which were merely part of that which comes forth of its own physis, nature, as we call it, are separate. So they were not too worried about leaving the bodies to decompose in the water. They said, what's the difference? We've been taught that the suke goes one way and the things of nature, the soma, go the other way, and so no problem. But the ordinary Athenians didn't know about that, so they were clamoring to put to death these generals. The idea being not so much that they mourned the dead, but rather that they were very concerned that that which was one, because they didn't have the idea of the separation, to reiterate, of the soul and the body, would be buried, interned properly in a sepulchre, chiefly so that it would not run riot through the earth. In other words, the decomposing body in the sea, in the earth, will become ghost spirits and will cause havoc. So this was the reason they wanted to put these generals to death, for not retrieving the bodies so that they could be interred properly, and so everybody would be okay. And the reason they held that belief, again, is because they hadn't been exposed to the new teaching yet. So when we have these sayings, and actually, if you look, Heidegger does say it pretty explicitly. We're still Parmenides, when he says being and thinking are the same, he's already presupposing being as that which comes forth of its own, namely as physis. Being is already thought as physis, so physis in this originary flowing soaked in this originary light of the Greeks. Think of Aristotle's saying about the sweetness of merely being, the sweetness of just being, in contradistinction to modern times when there's so many pressures and stresses pushing one around, that you get these Hobbesian and Rousseauian arguments over the nature of man in a way specific to that. But staying with the first problem, we have to see that what Heidegger is saying is that even though he almost misleads us, or sometimes does mislead us through his great praise of the early thinkers, what he's really saying is he's raising them up in order to think being as it's only now been glimpsed in the end of metaphysics. And try to see if you can look at that in some. There's when Parmenides will say, if he speaks of being, he's speaking ontically. This is what Heidegger's saying. He says that being and thinking are the same. You see, he's able to hold this whole thought together. He's not counting. He knows that the suke, his own suke, is separate from physis, but he doesn't try to think his suke and physis together in one thought. And he doesn't come to the conclusion that if he does that, or at the same time, if language is made into the being of beings and set alongside it, either way, in thinking that whole amalgam, we're thinking ontically, we're creating an object, which then again we're sort of surrounding, pushed out of our consciousness, and then, at length you have, again, these Chalmers things. But you see how there's a problem there. Heidegger's trying to, in his concept of Dasein, this is what he's trying to overcome, that we keep thinking things ontically, which is, again, why in thinking this with Husserl, and I still think, I appreciate Dreyfus now more than I used to, but I still think it's very misleading the way he makes Descartes into the bad guy, because Descartes is really almost thinking in the same way as Heidegger and Husserl and the rest of them, even Hegel and the rest of them, if you compare it to the way the dominant thought in the rich North Atlantic West and the English-speaking countries is today, where some kind of talk of, that's merely subjective, that's merely psychological, that's not the stuff of the instrumental, experimental inventor that we call the scientist. And there's always the dominant thinking today is much further away from what Heidegger and Husserl and all these guys are talking about than was the thinking that was raised by Descartes. So I think Dreyfus, in the way he puts up an obstacle to thinking, because we get much closer to Heidegger by going to Descartes than we do through the thinking that's now customary. In this connection, just say one word again from the Grundbegriffe, which is probably, we're not taking to heart enough, I think. I end with one sentence. We have to assume an attitude whose achievement requires no special knowledge in advance, neither scientific nor philosophical.